Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So we have a new week here. The 20-week SMA and the 21-week EMA have continued to slowly move higher. They now range from 54,830 up to 56,180 or so. So approximately just 55 to 56K. More importantly, one of the shorter term moving averages that we have said will come into play over the next few months is in fact the 8-week moving average, which is currently just higher than where the price of Bitcoin is right now at 67,839. So the 8-week moving average is actually about $1,000 higher than the price of Bitcoin, at least at the time that I'm making this video. By the time you're watching it, obviously the price of Bitcoin could be different, but that is where we are. And this is precisely the moving average that we previously said that we're likely going to interact with quite a lot here over the next couple of months. And we can go back and look at a lot of examples of Bitcoin interacting with the 8-week SMA after it cools off. And not only can you look back at prior market cycles, you can also just simply look at this market cycle and see instances where Bitcoin finds itself below the 8-week SMA, and we find ourselves there once again. Now, historically, what we've seen basically there's two cases where Bitcoin got below the 8-week SMA and then pretty quickly got back above it. So if I were to point those out, you can see this case right here, get below that 8-week SMA, and then it quickly got back above it basically the following week. We also saw that same thing happen right here, right? Gets below the 8-week SMA, long wick down, and then just gets right back above it the following week. What's interesting is that if you look at this, if you sort of break it up into three moves, right? So we've talked a little bit about this before, but sort of your first wave, your second one, and then your third. The first wave had a pretty short period below its 8-week SMA. The second wave, though, had a much longer period below its 8-week SMA, and it actually guided the 8-week SMA actually guided Bitcoin down to the bull market support band, coincidentally at around the same time of the year. So last year we saw Bitcoin go below its 8-week SMA in May. We're almost in May, and then it essentially guided it down to the bull market support band. We had a wick down to it in late May, and then we were actually getting wicks below it in June. So in this case, you have your first wave where your first wick here below the 8-week SMA was relatively short-lived, just like it was over here. You have a second move up, and then now it's starting to fade again. And so this is, and again, obviously in the short term, Bitcoin's up. But again, the speculation that I previously have outlined many, many times is that this was basically what was going to happen, because what essentially should theoretically happen is that Bitcoin bounces around up here for a little while so that it chops the altcoin market up on their Bitcoin pairs, right? That's exactly what we've seen happen before. And I do think, at least based on historical seasonality, that we could see something like that once again, where we just sort of, hang around in this area for a while, but during that period, all Bitcoin pairs get chopped up. Now, there's an interesting thing that I want to tie everything back together with, and it's basically what happened going into June last year. And going into June last year, we essentially had this thing where Bitcoin was fading back to the 20-week SMA, and then it held it as support, okay? And then we got another move up. Now, I mentioned that there's a decent chance we see Bitcoin fade into the bull market support band into May and June, right? I've said that many, many times, but I've also said that, you're not just going to go down there in a straight line. as you've seen with all these other periods over here, it's a very slow process to get down there, right? A very slow process to get down there, and it can take a while, right? It can certainly take a while to see that actually play out. But there's something that's really, really interesting about this trend if we sort of peel back the layers a little bit, and it all relates back to, you guessed it, the dominance of Bitcoin. Now, I want to overlay the dominance of Bitcoin onto this chart, and you will see how really when it first found this local top about a year ago and started to fade, right? You can see it started to fade. Bitcoin dominance did get a pullback initially, right? You can see that it got a pullback, but you might think, well, the reason Bitcoin dominance went back up was because Bitcoin went up. And there may be some truth to that statement. But if you look really closely and you draw a line at where Bitcoin USD got that major bounce off the 20-week SMA, you can see that Bitcoin dominance had already started to turn around before that, right? So Bitcoin dominance turned around here, even as Bitcoin USD was still bleeding to its 20-week SMA and even slightly below it, right? You see that? You see how dominance had already gone up a lot, and then Bitcoin USD went up, and then of course Bitcoin dominance went up with it, but dominance was already going up before Bitcoin USD saw that move. Now, the reason why that this is an important factor for Bitcoin USD is if you look at Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins, you will see, in fact, that every summer, June and then July, right, and then here June, potentially June again, every time we get into the summer months, at least recently during this entire business cycle, or the rate hiking cycle essentially, we've seen, this was slightly before it, we've seen dominance go up into June. Okay, we've seen it go up into June, and I think that dominance excluding stables is going to be going up to about 64% this summer, meaning dominance including stables should theoretically find itself out around 60%, right? So you can see that would be 64%. Dominance including stables is currently at 55. That would get it to that 60% level. But what you'll notice is that there were two of these Junes, it tagged the trend line, but then the third June, it did not. And I think I have an explanation for that. Of course, it is easy to come up with explanations in hindsight. It's one of the benefits of hindsight, right? But overlay Bitcoin USD onto this chart, right? Look at this. Do you see how in the, I'm trying to stall as the price loads. Do you see how in the first tag of this trend line, it was actually after Bitcoin USD fell, right? So Bitcoin USD fell, and as it fell, dominance hit the trend line. You see that pretty clearly, right? Then over here, when dominance excluding stables hit the trend line, it was while Bitcoin USD was falling. You could argue that Bitcoin dominance excluding stables was going to hit the trend line last June as Bitcoin USD was fading, but instead we got another Bitcoin pump last minute, and then it still faded for the rest of the summer, but that was enough to keep the dominance excluding stables from actually tagging the upper part of that trend line, right? So what if you get, this time, you get basically the same thing that happened last year, but what if there isn't that final pump in June that sort of keeps it from hitting the top of the trend line, right? So again, it's not a sure thing. I still think Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio is going to be better than altcoin heavy because I think dominance is going to go up to this level. But I just want to explore that idea very briefly because there does exist a scenario where that could theoretically happen. And the way that that could actually work out, if I were to go back over here and pull up Bitcoin USD, you can compare it to this cycle, of course, but you can also compare it to prior cycles, right? The 20-week SMA and the 8-week SMA. And there's three main periods that I like to compare this to. The first one, and it's probably the one I put the most value in because it was during a similar phase of the cycle as it pertains to monetary policy and high interest rates and quantitative tightening, is 2019. And you can see that in 2019, after Bitcoin got its first weekly close below the 8-week SMA, it then rallied back up slightly above it, right? Which is, potentially what you're seeing happen right now, right? We've seen a little bit of a rally here over the last week or so. And now as Bitcoin's going up right now, you can see that dominance of Bitcoin is actually going up with it, right? Remember, in 2021, when Bitcoin USD got this little rally right here, where Bitcoin dominance went down, now we're starting to see Bitcoin dominance go up a little. That might not be the fairest statement because we did see Bitcoin dominance get a pretty big pullback. But for me, it's hard to say that Bitcoin dominance is in a big pullback when now it seems like it's just trying to hold support, the same range that it previously was holding resistance at for a long time that a lot of people thought was the top. Now it seems like it's just holding what people thought was the top 4 months ago. It's now holding that level as support, right? In fact, that level of support was right around, or that level of resistance previously was 55%. Now it seems like Bitcoin dominance is trying to hold above 55%. So you can see that there does exist a scenario where it just simply plays out like that, right? Where Bitcoin USD is doing the same thing that it did back over here, right? Where it gets below the 8-week, it gets a 2-week rally back above it. It then chops around for a little bit, and then it falls. Okay, so there's something to be said about that potential outcome. Again, it doesn't have to play out like that. I know a lot of people are calling for much higher Bitcoin USD prices. I would encourage you to see those other views because there's always a chance it's a left translated cycle, and we get a much earlier peak than a lot of people are thinking in terms of the entire market cycle. But I do think that is one thing to look at because there was sort of a mid-cycle slowdown last cycle. Now, this cycle, that mid-cycle slowdown hasn't really occurred, but arguably it hasn't occurred because we haven't seen the rate cutting part of the market cycle yet, which is what we saw over here. This was sort of the rate cutting part of the cycle. We haven't reached that point, so we can't say for sure that won't happen. I still think there's a chance that it could play out like that. And so when you look at this, what you should see theoretically happen is that as Bitcoin USD chops around in this range, maybe going slightly above the 8-week SMA, going back below it, kind of something like that over the next month or so, look to see Bitcoin dominance make that move to the higher levels. Now, do you remember what we said earlier when Bitcoin dominance excluding stables hit the top of the trend line here in June 2021 and in June 2022? It didn't in June 2023. Right? But I think the reason is because Bitcoin got this move rather than sort of capitulating down like the prior 2 Junes. It got that move and kept the dominance from actually going back up to the top of the trend line as there then was renewed interest in the altcoin market. Sometimes when Bitcoin stays flat at a certain level like that above its 20-week SMA and it's not continuing to push higher, then there can be a shorter term rotation into altcoins. Now you can see that's what exactly happened, but dominance has still continued to go up on a much larger scale. So what if there's this scenario where Bitcoin spends the next couple of months chopping up the altcoin market up here, right? And then you potentially get into June, and then we are looking at this June where you got a move up, but instead of another move up, what if you just get a move down below the 20-week SMA? I still think there's this process that should theoretically play out where Bitcoin dominance tops before Bitcoin USD falls below the 20-week SMA, or it could correspond to that same week, right? That same week that Bitcoin closes below the 20-week SMA could be the time when Bitcoin dominance theoretically tops. And there's an interesting thing to look at here as to how it could theoretically relate to the macro. And that's if you assume that this is where we are, we're currently in the rally, basically back up to the 8-week SMA in July of 2019. If you assume that that's essentially where we are right now, and that the market's just going to slowly fade off and on, put in lower highs as that bull market support band slowly catches up, then look to see what the altcoin market does. If I'm wrong, what it would mean is that alt Bitcoin pairs would not go down, right? So I think alt Bitcoin pairs are going to go down throughout this period here. I think alt Bitcoin pairs will go down throughout that period if that is in fact where we are. If that's not where we are and we're somewhere else, in the cycle, not just before rate cuts, kind of like over here, then you might see alt Bitcoin pairs do something different, right? But, I remember back in 2019 seeing us get back below the 8-week SMA, rallying back up to it the following week, seeing another weekly close above it the week after that, and then fading down. And then what happened is that what essentially happened is that if you take this date range here from the current week that we're theoretically in, it took about 8 weeks after that or so to see your first weekly close below the bull market support band. And the reason why that is kind of interesting is because 8 weeks from now would put us out in June, right? And June is precisely the time where I've said that you could see Bitcoin dominance come back up to the top of this wedge. And it could correspond to Bitcoin falling below its 20-week moving average in June. It could also occur before that, but there's another macro reason why that could come into play, right? There's another macro reason why you might actually see it fall below the 20-week SMA in June. And it actually goes back to the unemployment rate, right? So if you actually go look at the unemployment rate and we pull that up, one of the things you may note is that last year there's some seasonality associated with it. So if you look at last year, you can see there was a top by the unemployment rate, a local top in February. It then fell in March and April, and then it got a big move up in May, right? Now, remember, we get the data 1 month later. So if this says May, that means we got this data point in June, right? But essentially it dropped from 3.6 to 3.5 to 3.4 starting in February. Look at this. This is February. Started at 3.9 though. 3.9 to 3.8 instead of what we saw last year, it was 3.6 to 3.5. Now, if this pattern continues to repeat, which it probably won't, but if it did, then it would mean the unemployment rate could still potentially go down on the next data point, potentially back down to 3.7, right? If it were to follow this. Now, I'm not saying that it will, but if it does go to 3.7, it might give everyone the assumption that we're just sort of going back down. But what if then in June, which would be the May data point, which is this one, you see it go here last year, it went from 3.4 to 3.7 in a single month. So what happens if we bleed down to 3.7 by the next data point, and then in June we get the May data point that gets it to 4%? I've said many times that 4% unemployment rate is when the Fed will start to pay attention. 4%. So if we hit 4% unemployment rate in May, it means that that data point's not going to come until June, right? So when we get the May data point, it will actually be for April. So then theoretically, if there is some seasonality associated with this and you get a spike in the unemployment rate in May, you're not going to see that reflected until June. And so the way that could potentially play out on the Bitcoin USD chart is you basically spend the next couple of months chopping around this range as alt Bitcoin pairs drop, while Bitcoin USD stays strong, right? Again, I've said that forever, that what you would likely see going into the summer is for Bitcoin to sort of spend some time up in this range, chopping the altcoin market up, kind of like what it did over here, which is basically exactly a year ago, and also what it did over here in 2019, where it chopped the altcoin market up. Now, again, I know a lot of people would look at this and say, well, why can't it play out the same way? Why can't it just go back to the 20-week SMA and hold it as support and then get a rally into June, just like we saw last year? In fact, in 2019, we had a rally into June where Bitcoin put in a higher high. So I don't want to sit here and say that it can't happen. And I will continue to remind you that the biggest counterpoint to all of my views would be the views that other people express about a left translated peak. And I bring those views up not to dunk on those views, but to say there's some validity to those views. And you should consider that view, in my opinion, in your investing journey, right? It's a valid view that has merit. We've seen those types of market cycles before where you'll essentially see the market top out in the election year. It happened in 2000. It actually happened in March of 2000, right? There's an uncomfortable truth that, the top could be already in and it'd be a left translated peak. That's one option. It's not my base case. But there's other cases where you have left translated peaks where the peaks occur in the summer of the election year. That was in the 1970s. You have another example in the 1940s. Or sorry, no, that was in the 1940s, the local top occurred in the summer. in the 1970s during high inflation, we saw a local top in December of the election year. So the biggest case to sort of go against my view is if there's a left translated peak, which does have evidence for it. Again, it does. And you might say, well, how do you resolve that with your view of a potential summer lull? And again, guys, the whole way you resolve it is to just have Bitcoin, right? I mean, like, that way if Bitcoin stays elevated or goes up, you're hedged for that. And if it goes down, if Bitcoin were to go down, then it's probably going to go down less than the altcoin market, right? And even if it does go down, you still could have a while before that even plays out, right? So the reason why Bitcoin dominance could theoretically top this summer is because I could envision a scenario where the unemployment rate hits 4% this summer. Now, you might say, well, if the unemployment rate hits 4%, wouldn't that cause altcoins to drop more than Bitcoin? It's true that it could lead to the final capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs, but the only thing the unemployment rate hitting 4% means is that the Fed's likely going to come to the rescue and start lowering interest rates. And if the Fed starts lowering interest rates, then people that were basically sticking with only Bitcoin because of higher monetary or stricter monetary policy might actually branch out to the altcoin market more. Now, the problem with that in the short term is that while that can be a longer term useful strategy, because last cycle we actually saw alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out before alt USD pairs. If you look last cycle, alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed out in September of 2019, right when the Fed cut interest rates. Right after the Fed cut interest rates, when they shifted from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing, right? That's when alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed right here, and it was after the local top by Bitcoin USD was in. But then the altcoin market bled for a few months on their USD pairs, not their Bitcoin pairs, but on their USD pairs after that happened. And I think that's why Bitcoin dominance could theoretically top as we fall below, or maybe just before we fall below, the 20-week moving average. Okay, so that is kind of my base case at the moment, is that Bitcoin USD chops around in this range, breaks the alt Bitcoin pairs down, so that by the time it's June and Bitcoin dominance gets another rally on potentially a Bitcoin USD drop, that is then theoretically when you could see the dominance excluding stables go to the top of this trend line. Again, last year it didn't hit it, but we also had another spike by Bitcoin USD. The last two times we hit the wedge, it was right as Bitcoin was dropping. So I could see a scenario like that where alt Bitcoin pairs bleed for the next 2 months, they bottom out this summer, and then alt USD pairs go down until Bitcoin stops going down. And then when Bitcoin USD starts to go back up, because the Fed has cut enough and they've switched back to QE, then alt USD pairs go up. But they lead, because then that's why everyone likes alts, is because they tend to outperform in a bull market. But I think what people messed up over the last 2.5 years is that they outperform in a QE bull market, but in a QT bull market, Bitcoin outperforms. And that's why you can see that the dominance of Bitcoin has basically been going up since May of 2021, right? And that was actually when the social risk actually topped out, was in May of 2021. You can look at the social risk right here and see that retail was mostly here in May of 2021, and ever since then, social risk has been putting in lower highs. So with regards to Bitcoin USD, I think that the interaction with the 8-week moving average is going to be key over the next few weeks, right? And again, I'm not saying we can't go above it. The 8-week SMA is, again, it's about $1,000 higher than the current price. It's around 67,800 or so, 67.8 to 67.9. So it's not that you can't go above it. And in fact, in 2021, when we got a bounce kind of coming out of late April, it went above the 8-week SMA. And in 2019, when we got a bounce coming out of sort of a weekly close below it, it went above the 8-week SMA, right? So you have two examples where it went above the 8-week SMA. You also have some examples where it doesn't, and that it basically looks at last year. Right, so if you look at last year during sort of the second wave, we got below the 8-week. We got a rally back up to it, but it was ultimately rejected, and then we went back down to that bull mark support band. But by the time we got back down here upon the rejection by the 8-week, that's where Bitcoin dominance started to go up. It was when it got rejected by the 8-week SMA. So if we were to get rejected by the 8-week SMA, it actually might cause alt Bitcoin pairs to drop as well. because the only reason they're probably up is they're speculating that Bitcoin's going to continue to run. The thing to watch, and I've said this many times, look at ETH Bitcoin. It's not going up right now, right? It's continuing to drop. And that's basically your telltale sign for the altcoin market. It doesn't mean that some of them aren't showing a little bit of strength in the short term on their Bitcoin pairs, but look at ETH Bitcoin. I mean, it's not really doing that well at the current time. And if it were to get a bounce, I still would argue that it's going to be rejected at around 0.053, which is where the bull market support band is, somewhere between 0.053 and 0.054. Again, no guarantee that it gets up there in the first place. So again, I would keep an eye on that 8-week SMA for Bitcoin. And I do wonder if, like last year, we're going to basically look at this play out, right? And I wonder if people are going to then assume that you're going to get a move into June, which you could, right? If it's a left translated peak, you very well could. But what happens if it bleeds into the summer? And then instead of getting that bounce in June, what happens if you get an unemployment rate print at 4%, and then instead of getting a bounce up like that, it then goes below the 20-week SMA, and then Bitcoin dominance tops out, which is precisely where it topped out last cycle, right? When Bitcoin fell below the 20-week SMA. It topped in September as those rate cuts were coming in, right? And so, I would look to that as a potential blueprint for what could theoretically happen getting a little bit later into this year. But again, the first thing that needs to happen, I think, is that Bitcoin USD just has to spend a little bit of time chopping the altcoin market up. Because the thing is like, this is the way it works, essentially, is that Bitcoin will dump, right? And then it'll rally, and then it'll dump, and then it'll rally. And, the first time it dumps and rallies, Bitcoin pairs get a nice boost. The second time, they don't get as big of a drop, or they don't get as big of a jump. And you overlay this with ETH Bitcoin, right? So if you overlay this with ETH Bitcoin, you put this onto the chart, you see how while Bitcoin USD has been chopping around up here, ETH Bitcoin just keeps on dropping, right? The reason is because the altcoin market can't catch a bid in the same way as Bitcoin can, and a lot of people are still converting their altcoins to Bitcoin, right? So you can very clearly see that that's what's happening, is that Bitcoin's chopping around at these highs, just like it did over here, and just like it did in 2019. And while it does that, ETH Bitcoin goes down and alt Bitcoin pairs go down. Now, on any given week, maybe an altcoin goes up on its Bitcoin pair, but most altcoins were just putting in new lows in their Bitcoin pairs last week or 2 weeks ago. So I would really focus on this as we get into the summer, because there could be a scenario where everyone's looking at it and thinking that it's going to bounce off the 20-week SMA in June. But what happens if we just go below it because the unemployment rate? Again, it's nothing against Bitcoin. It's nothing against, crypto. It's just what, if the macro holds up or not. And so I do wonder if that is kind of a narrative that a lot of people aren't necessarily looking at is, do you see the labor market finally show some weakness this summer, which is when it started to show weakness last summer. Is basically when we got the June print, but we got the May data in June, right? We got the May data in June, and then you could see how it would actually play out across the entire Cryptoverse. If you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, we know that they broke down 1 month before the first rate cut, right? And I wonder if this, if this long wick down where it sets a new low is similar to this long wick down where it sets a new low. And then the following month, you see alt Bitcoin pairs durably go below that low, right? So the following month would be May. And then remember last cycle when alt Bitcoin pairs fell below this, it was then 1 month later in July where the Fed started to cut. So you could get a scenario where alt Bitcoin pairs drop below the range low in May, and then the Fed potentially cuts in June. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. You're like, well, the odds of a rate cut right now aren't really that high. And you're right. I mean, they're not. But I also know that stuff can change relatively quickly. So if you were to go look at interest rate probabilities, the market right now is only expecting about a 16.5% chance in June of the Fed going to 5.25. Now, I mean, if you look here, there's actually a 17% chance that they'll cut. It could be, there's some people sort of speculating that they might be down to 5% by then. So only about a 17% chance of a cut in June. But I mean, I think that this number would go up quite a bit if the first week of June we get an unemployment rate print at 4%, then you could actually get the first rate cut in June, and then maybe the second one in September, and then skip November because it's an election year, and then maybe the third one in December. Now, they have started to walk back interest rate cut expectations. Even the market is only thinking you're going to get 2 cuts for basically the next year. Now that the market finally believes higher for longer, you're starting to see a lot of these altcoins show a ton of weakness on their Bitcoin pairs. I wouldn't get too consumed by what's happening here in the short term on this little bounce. I said before, even over here, we got one little final bounce where it got rejected below the bull market support band and then capitulated down here to the range lows. I think something like that is probably going to happen again for alt Bitcoin pairs. So the way that you could see alt Bitcoin pairs go back down is if, either Bitcoin rallies above the 8-week SMA or if it gets rejected by it. I could see either scenario breaking alt Bitcoin pairs down. So it should be a process. Again, it could very well continue to go on for a number of weeks. There's actually one other interesting way here in the short term to look at this market, and that's to actually look at daily candles for Bitcoin USD. And what you'll notice is that it looks like it's kind of in a parallel channel here, right? So if you kind of connect the dots with these, with this range, right? So let me just try to get this as accurate as possible. So we're going to get those highs and the lows, right? So you see we've connected the top to this top, and then this low to these lows, right? So there's pretty clearly a channel that Bitcoin is starting to form right here. And I think that if you look at 2019, there was also a channel that was starting to form. And it was also looked really, really similar, right? I mean, Bitcoin USD essentially started to form this channel, right? And then it essentially stayed in that channel for a long time. And then when it finally broke out, and then it dropped back into it during the pandemic crash. But you can see that channel there by Bitcoin USD that formed just before those rate cuts arrived, right? You had a top and then a lower high in quick succession, right? In quick succession, you had that. And then a couple months later, you had another lower high, or I guess it was only a month later, right? You had another lower high. So 2 pretty quick in quick succession, and then about a month later, you then had another lower high at the top of that channel. So if you were to go look at it right here and look at a very similar channel, you essentially have this one and this one basically back to back, right? This is March, this is April. And remember, in 2019, those first 2 tops were June and July, right? So you had June and July, and then the next one was August, a lower high at the top of the channel. And then if you go look over here, you'll see something very similar, right? Instead of June, July, and August, what if it's March, April, and May? Okay, so there does still even exist a scenario where Bitcoin could go north of 70K and still be in this channel, right? It doesn't necessarily mean anything. And in fact, if it were to continue this path, you'll see here that the next time we have a Fed meeting is May 1st. Right? It's May 1st. So the next time we have a Fed meeting is right here. So if Bitcoin rallies into that meeting, I mean, you can kind of see that it would be right there, right? And then what if we go into the meeting and Bitcoin's rallying into the meeting and everyone's like, all right, well, after the meeting, it's going to go to the moon. And then the Fed just comes out and squashes everyone's hopes and dreams of rate cuts once again, and then the market, alt Bitcoin pairs finally capitulate in May, right? Which again, kind of looks similar to what we saw back over here, right? Where they kind of got this final bounce back up, not even to the bull market support, but it got close. What if that's kind of the same thing that's happening here? And then they just sort of top out, and then they capitulate into May, and then the Fed cuts in June. So you could see the Fed come out in May, very much meaning business. Like, hey, we're not going to cut, but don't listen to what the Fed says. Watch what they do. And I can practically guarantee you, again, I was saying that the Fed was going to go to 5.5% when we were basically back at 2%. And now that the market believes that we're only going to get 2 cuts over the next year, it's that very act of believing that potentially means it's not going to happen. The pricing out of rate cuts will likely cause them to get priced back in. So I don't know exactly how high Bitcoin is going to go here in the short term. Obviously, with the channel where it is, a lower high could still theoretically be just north of 70K. It could be below 70K. Right now, we're actually kind of at the midpoint of the channel. So that could offer some resistance for a little bit too. I don't really know. I don't really have a great ability to predict short-term moves in Bitcoin. It might just get rejected here and go straight down to the 20-week SMA. I mean, hell, the S&P has already gone to the 20-week SMA, and so too has the Nasdaq. The Nasdaq's actually below it, and the Russell is actually below it. So I don't see any reason why Bitcoin can't go there. But the other reason why I'm not so optimistic about Bitcoin holding its 20-week SMA in June and potentially seeing the final capitulation of all Bitcoin pairs in June is because normally you would expect to see the bull market support band get tested about every 2 to 3 months in order to hold it as support, right? In 2017, as long as we were testing it every 2 to 3 months, we held it as support. But then once we basically went longer and we went 5 months, we failed to hold it as support. Same thing in 2019, right? We got above it in April, but we didn't get back down to it until September. So that was about 5 months later, and then we failed to hold it as support. Same thing right here. We got above it in October, or we held it in October, and then we fell below it in May, right? So normally when you see it hold as support, it's because we're testing it every 2 to 3 months, right? But the problem here, and I said I think this might come back to bite us one day, is we didn't actually test it in January. We didn't actually test it as support. And so what that means is that it's actually been about 27 weeks since we last tested it. So if you compare that to these last two times, that's 31, 32 weeks in late 2020, early 2021. And then in 2019, from getting, holding it as or getting above it to then when we tested it was 25 weeks later. I mean, these are give or take a week or two. I'm not getting it exact. Right now we're at 27 weeks, right? So it's already been a long time. And that's why I'm not as optimistic as holding it as support. And again, the biggest counterpoint to all of my stuff is to consider the left translated cycle peak theory, right? Consider that theory as the biggest evidence for why my view might not be correct on this. Because there are, there certainly is some evidence to suggest that. And there's a lot of other people that talk about that. And, I've looked at what they have, and I can even pull up charts that show similar types of things. But I do think that the breakdown of ETH Bitcoin kind of changes the calculus on this stuff, right? I mean, ETH Bitcoin has broken down, and it's not showing strength. It's not showing strength, which to me kind of represents that the consumer is starting to falter. Right? Degens aren't degenning as much anymore because this thing just keeps on going down. It hasn't found a low. And by the way, this low here was in June. This low here was in June. And if you connect the dots on those lows and you go to here, this June, that puts you at around 0.0375, which 0.0375 is basically what I've said is the target for me for ETH Bitcoin for the last 2.5 years, at least on ITC Premium. I don't know how many times I've said it on the public channel, but 0.0375 is something I've said for quite a long period of time. And again, this low was in June, this low was in June, and then this low was also in June. We didn't actually go all the way down, but remember Bitcoin also got that bounce in June. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of look at this market and dissect it. Again, I personally think that the altcoin market is still bleeding back to Bitcoin. And I think capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs is likely going to occur, probably, I think we're already in the process of it. I just think this is sort of the final dead cat bounce of alt Bitcoin pairs before they enter into their final capitulation, which probably takes place in May, June, and July. And they could bottom out in June, but sometime like May, June, July, I think we might actually see alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out. Another piece of evidence for that view is that if you look at this part right here, when alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed out, they actually bottomed out when social risk started to form a sort of a base in a higher low, right? So they bottomed out in September of 2019 after the social risk bottomed over here, it bounced and it came back down. It was that higher low by social risk where Bitcoin dominant or where alt Bitcoin pairs bottomed. And you can see that social was put in this low, it's bounced, and then now I feel like it might come back down here and form some type of a macro higher low, where then theoretically alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out this summer, because a lot of times in the summer people don't care as much about trading cryptocurrencies, and therefore if the bid disappears for altcoins, then they bleed against Bitcoin, and the bid's been disappearing for altcoins for a long time, at least as it pertains to their Bitcoin pairs. So those are my views on the market. Bitcoin is basically doing pretty much what it normally does after getting a close below the 8-week SMA, right? It rallies back up to it and it tries to test it. It's doing the same exact thing that it has done every single one of these moves. Every single one of these moves. The same exact thing. So you should not be surprised. And in fact, remember, on all these videos that we've been talking about, Bitcoin dominance, Bitcoin dubious speculation, the bull market support band, it was always, once you come back down here and you sweep the low, then you could potentially go back up to that 8-week moving average. And it will be the interaction of Bitcoin USD with the 8-week SMA that should theoretically cause alt Bitcoin pairs to continue to drop. And you can see it happening now, right? You can see that Bitcoin dominance is starting to slightly go back up. You can even see that ETH Bitcoin is continuing its slow drop down. It's taking place over a very long period of time, but it is still taking place. It is still taking place. So that's my general thoughts here on the market. And you know, if we do take out all of these highs and it's not just sort of sweeping the high, kind of like what you saw over here where we kind of went back up and swept the high. If we take out that high and then hold it as support, then I would say there's a ton of evidence that there would be a lot more evidence for a left translated peak if that happens. But if on the other hand, it just kind of does this mid-cycle correction where alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out this summer and then alt USD pairs finally capitulate, then it might just play out like a normal cycle, right? And you might say, well, isn't it kind of late in the cycle for us to see something like that? Not necessarily, right? I mean, again, if you look at alt Bitcoin pairs and you take a bar pattern from this, I don't know why I always forget where this stuff is, but if you take a bar pattern from this capitulation there to that alt season that occurred, and you just sort of overlay that there, right? That has these alt Bitcoin pairs topping out in Q1 of 2026, which is when they topped out in 2018, right? And you can even see kind of how you would connect the dots, you know? I mean, so I don't really think that it's too late in the cycle for something like that to happen. I really don't. I think that the cycle is throwing us a curveball and making a lot of people think that it's a left translated peak where the peak occurs a lot earlier. But what happens if it's just a mid-cycle top that causes Bitcoin to bleed, you know, for a while this year, making people give up on it, and then we just pick up in 2025 as the Fed has gone back to much looser monetary policy. You know, there's certainly a chance that could happen. And by the way, just like 2019, Bitcoin did not put in a new low, but a lot of altcoins did, you know? I mean, and you can kind of understand how that could happen because, you know, Bitcoin is so far above its highs that even if it were to get a big drop into these prior ranges, like, I mean, 2019, it actually dropped to the 100-week moving average. That's where it actually dropped down to as those rate cuts arrived, right? It dropped to the 100-week moving average right here. I mean, you can even see that it rallied above the 100-week SMA about 100%. Here, it rallied above it over 100% too, right? So, I mean, you can certainly imagine how something like that, you know, just going back there, if Bitcoin can drop back to that level or even close to that level, and altcoins are already barely off their lows, they're only like 2x. A lot of them are only 2x off their lows. That's how those altcoins can put in new lows, even in a situation where, say, Bitcoin doesn't. And so that's why, you know, when you're in these market cycles and you're in a quantitative tightening period and a higher interest rate period, it makes sense in my mind to just stay Bitcoin heavy as the Bitcoin dominance just continues to slowly grind higher, right? And then, you know, everyone keeps dreaming of alt season, but alt season that you want doesn't really occur until sometime well after the Fed has pivoted to looser monetary policy. And usually it's not right when they pivot. It's usually by the last rate cut, right? So by the last rate cut, that's when the alt season that you want probably finally arrives. Until then, I think Bitcoin dominance is going to go up, and I think it's going to go to 60%. And I would continue to look at Bitcoin USD up in this range to interact with its 8-week moving average, and for it to chop the altcoin market up in this range as the bull market support band slowly comes up here to meet it, potentially either in May or June. And then we'll have to figure out, do you get a bounce off of it like last summer, or does it capitulate below it like it did over here in 2019 after ETH Bitcoin broke down and after gold broke out, which, by the way, are two events that have already happened. The only event that hasn't really happened that, has me, again, there's always a reason to hedge, right? But the only reason that I'm, continuing to sort of put out that left translated idea for those that want to hedge is because alt Bitcoin pairs technically haven't broken down yet, right? Technically, they haven't, I think they're just in the final dead cat bounce here before they break down. That's what I think. And I think that they should stay below 0.45, right? They're at 0.43 now. I think they'll stay. I think they should stay below 0.45. You can see on this dead cat bounce, they did not make it back above that 20-week moving average. So as long as they stay below that and then they roll over into the summer months, then it's just playing out exactly like it did over here in 2019. Again, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.